Okay, we're rolling. Now, I realize there's a lot of background noise, but at least it's a low roar instead of these interspersed interruptions. Hopefully this is a little bit less distracting. We should have the sound quality issues resolved within 2 or 3 episodes. The equipment that I ordered should be here on Saturday, so that's another, counting this episode, another 3 episodes at most, until hopefully we have this sound issue resolved. But until then, please just bear with me if you would. So let's review what we went over last time. Last time we compared Lukács's version of Western Marxism to the practice of Marxism in the East. And we alluded to the fact that in the East, they didn't need Heidegger to have a Dasein-like experience of Marxism that was able to apply material dialectics in a practical way, in a constructive way, because they didn't have to overcome the barrier of a Cartesian establishment. So a lot of the things that we can no longer take for granted on an academic level and on a political level, and even now on a social level, they were able to take for granted. So they are able to trust their society and their fellow man and not have to be arbitrarily, right, by institutions and ivory tower intellectuals. And this led to socialism in one country, and this led to Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And in both cases, this led to explosive economic growth and massive increases in standards of living for the peoples of these countries. Okay? And then we talked about the tension that exists between man, society, and nature, and the relationship it has to the materialist dialectic. And in reference to that, we quoted Karl Marx himself. And so now we are going to continue our reading from paragraph 56. Marxists as early as Platonov have opted for regressing into Spinozism as a means to resolve the problem where subject and object collapse into the supreme substance. In this way, thinking consciousness is the mere attribute of substance, the most fundamental form of being. A little bit of background on Spinoza. Spinoza was a monist. So he believed that there was a single type of substance and that all things which exist as a result of that substance. So not only was he a monist, but he was also a determinist. So basically he took sort of Newtonianism kind of to its most extreme interpretation, right? Where Newtonian's 4 laws of gravity, equal and opposite reactions, so on and so forth. So for Spinoza, the universe is highly deterministic and mechanical and material, right? And so thinking, subjectivism, all these things are dependent projections on material reality. So basically, in that sense, he sort of flipped the Cartesian radical doubt on its head and inverted it, because where Descartes placed subjectivism as primary because it's the only thing that he could know for certain, Spinoza assumes the opposite. And he assumes, well, the only thing that we know for sure is that the material reality exists, and therefore the material reality is primary, and subjectivism itself depends on the material reality as a substrate, right? So in other words, that's where this sort of idea of, like, take the behaviorists, for example. Behaviorists believe this completely, where they believe that psychological phenomena are driven by physical phenomena. They're driven by brain chemistry. They're driven by habits that are driven by brain chemistry, right? So the whole idea of like Pavlov's dog, where, basically you can kind of program the human mind, that kind of has its basis in this sort of assumption as well. I'm not sure there's a direct connection between Spinozism and behaviorism, but they're working with the same basic assumption, right? Which is that the material reality is what's primary, the subjective reality is entirely dependent on the material reality. It's the extreme opposite of a Cartesian assumption, as I mentioned before. Moving on. Soviet philosopher Ilyenko goes so far as to draw out speculative cosmological implications of this view, according to which thought arises as a necessary attribute of matter to prevent the heat death of the universe by initiating a conscious cosmic catastrophe to reset it. Okay. That's interesting. I don't know Ilyenko at all, but that's certainly an interesting idea. Okay, moving on. Before we move on, actually, so yeah, he mentions here, thought arises as a necessary attribute of matter. Right? So, in his view, from what I gather, for matter to exist, consciousness has to exist as well, because consciousness, in some sense, preserves matter. So I guess he believes in this sort of idea of expanding and contracting the universe. I don't know. I'm speculating at this point. I don't really know what he was thinking, but that's an interesting idea. All right, moving on. The problem with Spinozism is not the view that mind and matter, subject and object, share reality, but the notion of reality as substance, a metaphysical view of the object already united with its subjective determinations. Substance thus has no stake in its attributes. What he's saying here is that, let me highlight that so you guys can help you guys keep up. What he's saying is that since the Spinozist view is deterministic, if you really take that idea seriously, then what he's saying is you have no stake in what actually happens, because whatever has to happen because it's deterministic. So there's this sort of physical determinacy and predictability to things, and if that's the case, there's nothing you can do to prevent it. And even if there is, you doing what you're doing to prevent it is itself part of the deterministic clockwork, right? So you can't really have a genuine dialectic if that's the case, because then even dialectic is mechanical and not really a discourse. That's what he's getting at. This is just one of the ways of resolving the problem by denying it altogether. Substance is mere objectivity given form by the mind. Substance is treated as supreme, antecedent, and given, but it is the repository of a dogmatic subjective determination, not true objectivity. So in other words, what he's saying is Spinoza is taking the material reality and material reality itself as supreme and antecedent, as a given, right? But that's an assumption that he's making. That's a subjective assumption that he's making. So he's denying the validity of subjectivity by relying on a subjective assumption about the nature of material reality. The Marxist-Spinozist view cannot ground the origins of proletarian consciousness, Marxism, and the Communist Party in reality. It represses its own origins and pretends these arise in perfect continuity with the self-same substance, effectively gaslighting himself. So right. So what he's saying is, you can't have this idea of a proletarian class that feels that something is at stake and them being involved in their society and their politics and their economy because it's deterministic. So if it's deterministic, then it doesn't matter if you work for a proletarian revolution, because it's going to happen spontaneously or it's not going to happen. It's highly deterministic, right? This view does not arise from any necessary procedure of thought, experience, or relation to the world. It is a metaphysical view that does not pay for itself in any way. It is an insight that cannot itself be reproduced materially, a pure dogmatism of the mind. What he's saying is there's no practical way to apply this. And what he means by metaphysical view is that it's not a phenomenological view. So he's using metaphysical as opposed to phenomenological and ontological. So having to do with things as they are and how they're experienced versus, as he put it, a dogmatism of the mind. So you have this dogmatic view of the way things are, and you use that dogmatic view to override reality as it's experienced and reality as it unfolds to you, and reality as it is, as it presents itself to you practically, right? So it's a form of religion. There never comes the decisive gesture of Marx of renouncing knowledge to suspend it back into being. Substance is the conceit of a knowledge that already inheres in being, perfectly continuous with the intellect, which at no point runs upon the limit of its pretensions. I'll read that one more time because that's a difficult sentence to process, but it's important. There never comes the decisive gesture of Marx of renouncing knowledge to suspend it back into being. Substance is the conceit of a knowledge that already inheres in being, perfectly continuous with the intellect, which at no point runs upon the limits of its pretension.